speaking of cynical, that would be me, Mark. I see a lot of preemptive celebrating about how this election is going to go, whether Joe Biden is there or not there. It's only 3 states we're talking about here: Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. They're 3 of the most corrupt states voting-wise, and even still, Joe Biden's polling within the margin of error most of the time. Are we doing a little celebration too early on this whole thing?
Oh, I think absolutely. I'm not exactly convinced that the Republican ground game is where it needs to be in terms of both turning out voters and there's 2 components of the ground game now, as you point out. I mean, it's not just about voter turnout. It's now about, stopping the quote unquote steal. I don't know if it's necessary. A lot of what happens, may not be stealing even in a legal sense, but there's a lot of bending the rules around the margins and finding ballots, that didn't exist a few years ago before they started mailing things out. And Wisconsin's liberal Supreme Court started bending the rules to allow drop boxes everywhere. And it's just become this, massive game. I mean, really, we've gone from having a country now where elections are, when everybody who is self-motivated to get out and vote turns out on the same day, and we all know within a few hours what the result is, to a situation where elections are all about who can harvest the most ballots by any means necessary. And that is kind of a terrifying, and it's frankly anti-democratic. And that's where we are. That said, I'm not quite as cynical as some people are. You got to remember, they threw everything in the kitchen sink at this problem in 2020. COVID gave them an excuse to mail out, ballots to absolutely everyone. They had nationwide riots and all this stuff. And Biden still only won by 40,000 votes across 3 states. I think we need to be very careful about watching for voter fraud and the ground game and all of that. But don't be totally black-pilled here. Things are a lot better for us than they were 4 years ago.
Yeah, they certainly are. Mark, if we are behind when it comes to ground game stuff, ballot chasing, things like that, things you just alluded to, and I believe we are as well from what I hear, I guess the million-dollar question is why, especially after 2020, did we just ignore this problem? But why? How could we still be so far behind after what we saw last time?
That's a really good question. A lot of it is just simple party dysfunction. Obviously there's been a lot of, problems within the RNC. Trump had disagreements with Ronna McDaniel. And then there was a, change over to Laura Trump now. And this, is all happening at a very late date. In a lot of critical places, we've seen collapse of state parties. Michigan, a critical state for Trump to win, has had endless problems and infighting within its, state Republican Party. And, all those things don't help. The other thing is, it simply comes down to a fundamental difference between the parties. Democrats are the party of, state-funded activists and unions and public sector unions and things like that. So, like, union members will literally get paid to go out and campaign on behalf of Democrats, frequently using your tax dollars. Whereas, Republicans are people that have jobs. It's a lot harder, a lot of the time to recruit Republicans to be, election workers.
Mark, these drop boxes in Wisconsin, these unmanned drop boxes in Wisconsin, for people who don't understand the nitty-gritty of politics, why is that a big deal? Why is it a big deal that there are drop boxes now, thanks to their dirty commie Supreme Court, all over the place? Why does it matter?
Well, for one thing, I don't know that there's a couple of different issues here. One is obviously there are often aren't very good rules or oversight of how many ballots are dropped into a drop box at a given time. There was Democrats have spent, years insisting that mail-in ballots and drop boxes don't lead to any sort of fraud. Well, earlier this year, I guess it was last fall, the largest city in Connecticut, Bridgeport, the mayoral election there was overturned by a judge because they caught a city employee on video stuffing a drop box full of, guess what, mail-in ballots. So we know that this is, a serious potential for fraud. The other thing is often about, how these drop boxes are deployed. In Wisconsin, there was a lot of criticism about how drop boxes, only showed up in, dense, areas in, heavily Democratic cities like Madison and things like that, whereas they were not, made available for the convenience of, more rural, conservative voters in Wisconsin. There's a lot of politicking and rules around these things that have been hotly debated, and to the extent that there are any regulations governing how these things are used, that it's not well enforced.
Let's set aside Pennsylvania for the time being. The Sun Belt is one of those things that people are kind of banking on it already. Well, Trump's going to win Georgia. Trump's going to win Arizona. Well, Georgia has 2 commie senators. Arizona hasn't voted red in a long time. Why am I supposed to anticipate this is going for Trump?
I don't know. I mean, this is sort of the $64,000 question. One of the interesting things that's been very consistent in polling for a long time, as you kind of noted, is that you're seeing a split between the fact that a lot of people are voting for Trump, who are also apparently voting for Democratic senators, because you see a lot of polls that show Trump way ahead in places like Arizona, but those same polls show that the Democratic candidate for Senate is handily winning that state. So what that should worry Republican voters, because a lot of it is widespread dissatisfaction with Biden and or concerns about his age. If they replace Biden at the top of the ticket, maybe some of those split ticket Democratic voters that have been voting for Trump will come home and vote for what they see as a more viable Democratic candidate if they replace Biden on the ticket. So I think that should be concerning.